Hi, my name is Ethan Connell, and welcome back to part 2 of the Battered Ballots video series. This is modern and historic methods of voter suppression, and what we're going to do is we're going to lead right off by discussing some of the historic methods of voter suppression that we've seen in the United States, and after that we're going to go really in depth on those modern methods of voter suppression that you can expect to see and we have been seeing in modern society. And we're going to start off by looking at, like I said, some of these historic methods. And the first one we're going to talk about is intimidation and violence, which are kind of lumped together because they're more physical as compared to a lot of the other legally ingrained methods of voter suppression that we're going to talk about. And with this, it's what we saw right after the Civil War. Not to say that, it wasn't common throughout all of American history, which it was, but it's very prevalent in that Reconstruction era where you have like the Ku Klux Klan, where they use violence as a catalyst for fear in order to keep African Americans and minorities out of the voting box. In order to achieve their political goals, they exacted violence and they exacted threats upon their own communities. And of course, we see the end of the Ku Klux Klan during the Grant administration, but intimidation and violence on the behalf of these citizens in the South is something that doesn't go away until well into the 1960s. And it's often in conjunction with a lot of these other methods of voter suppression. And I guess we'll now move on. Poll taxes is one that was a staple of Southern politics for a very long time, and it was regularly upheld by the Supreme Court as being legally just. It was basically when you go in to cast a ballot, you have to pay a small fee. It's a tax on your ballot. It's a poll tax. And this was prohibitive for many low-income groups, including African Americans. And it was one of those things which, in addition to the literacy test, which meant that before you were able to cast a ballot, you had to take a test proving you were educated. Both of these would have been prohibitive for low-income white communities as well, if it weren't for something called the grandfather clause. Now, what a grandfather clause did is that it dictated that your voting status or your exemption from voter laws was predicated on the voting status of your grandfather. Now, this was fine for many white Americans as they could trace their lineage back generations to land and property owners and people who could vote. But this was a problem for African Americans who, if they even could trace their lineage back, it was primarily through slavery. And they, of course, could not vote, which meant that they were unable to participate in the political process. And this is a prime example, in my opinion, of how the political system in the United States at this time catered to this one group, the white American, while it disproportionately targeted and discriminated against the African American. And we see this trend continue with the concept of property checks, in which the state now mandates that in order to cast a ballot, you have to have proof of property ownership, which was incredibly prohibitive for the African American community because the predominant majority of land ownership in the South is by white. It's by white people. And it made it nearly impossible for the African American community to vote. And we also have the concept of the all-white primary, which is where it really just gets overt, where they don't even try to hide the racial motivation behind it. They just say, no, we're going to hold this primary where we're not going to allow any people of color. And it seems anathemic to you and I in the modern era sitting here watching this, but it's a different age, which you have to understand. The Supreme Court routinely upheld the concept of an all-white primary in Texas because the law at that time, the political parties were private organizations, and they could say that whoever wanted to participate in them, they could decide. And it was the right of that private organization to say that no, they didn't want any people of color and they couldn't participate in that aspect of the political process, which is crazy to us, but in that day and age, that was the norm. That was how they suppressed voters. And now we're going to move into some that we may recognize in today's society that we might have seen in our day-to-day lives. These are modern methods of voter suppression. These are the ones that are happening in society right now as we speak, as the elections we're holding are going on. And the first one we're going to talk about is misinformation, which we talked about briefly in the last episode. Now, it's defined as false or inaccurate information, and that's exactly what it is. It's information distributed by a political actor in this case, or any actor, with the intent to deceive. And I put a couple examples here in the up on the screen just to show what kind of damaging effects these might have. In the 2020 election, voters were sent mailers that told them that the date of the election had changed. That resulted in scores of voters missing the election. And they were also in separate localities targeted by robocalls telling them that their voter registration was no longer valid. And as unfortunate as it is, it convinced voters that they were unable to vote, so they didn't even try. It's methods like these that have evolved into the modern era that we have to be the most cognizant of. It's easy to say like, oh yes, voter suppression, and you make that mental link with the grandfather clause and the poll tax. But extrapolating that to this is the only way we're going to be able to combat this moving forward. Now, misinformation almost ties in with intimidation and violence from earlier, as they're all actions that take place outside of the field of law and of government itself. Sure, they may be carried out by government actors or those who are in government, but they're not inherently related. From here on out, we'll be discussing methods of voter suppression that are institutionally rooted in government and in the law itself. And we're going to start with voter identification laws, which is a very contentious issue in the United States right now. But through the lens of voter suppression, you have to really look at the numbers, which I've put on the screen for you right here. Over 21 million Americans would be unable to vote are currently unable to vote under strict voter identification laws. It is something that we take for granted, the ability to have a photographic ID. In some communities, they have to travel over 200 miles to reach a identification office, or the cost of a photo ID could be prohibitive in itself. You have to have access to a number of documents, like a birth certificate. And the systems in acquiring these documents, or the systems for acquiring these documents, rather, are rather backwards in and of itself. In order to acquire your birth certificate, you have to have a form of identification, and in order to acquire a form of identification, you have to have a birth certificate. So it's this, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, except these people now can't vote. And 3% is the average drop nationwide, with states that have instituted strict voter ID laws. 3% of an electorate is an incredibly huge number. I mean, we see 3% and we think nothing of it, but this is thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, individual votes, individual voices in the political process that are suddenly invalidated and that can no longer exercise their right to vote. So voter identification laws cause problems in the ballot boxes and polling stations themselves, but sometimes voter suppression manifests itself long before the voter even gets to the ballot box. There are occasionally issues with registrations themselves, and that's where we come to voter roll purges. And for voter roll purges, I only have 3 things on this slide because those are the 3 main things to remember: good intentions, an objective failure, and a punitive cycle. And we're going to start with good intentions because we're going to talk about what a voter roll purge is. Now, this started back in the Reconstruction era, and it's continued as a regular practice to today's political society. But what it is it's the removal of voters from a registration roll at its simplest, be it for a death or inactivity or any other reason one might be removed from a voter registration roll. The reason it is an objective failure is because in practice they are executed almost exclusively, very, very poorly. Voter roll purges have been proven to both disproportionately target minority communities as well as routinely remove valid, bona fide voters from their voter rolls. Such a failure of a system that is meant to reinforce the integrity of our political system but ends up damaging it is incredible that it's been allowed to continue. And I mentioned earlier how you could be removed from a voter roll for inactivity. Now, what this has created inadvertently or advertently, however you want to look at it, is it's created this punitive cycle of governance as relating to the voter roll purge. Is where, say you have a community with low voter turnout, high levels of political apathy. The government will then, in turn, purge their voter rolls, which, in turn, reduces the amount of voters in the populace and decreases voter turnout yet again. And it creates this cycle where systemically low-income minority communities are being targeted for things like this, and their voter bases are shrinking. It's almost unthinkable in today's society that a system like this has not only been allowed to continue, it's been allowed to foster, and it's been allowed to thrive. And unfortunately, it's not the only one. There are other systems of societal injustice rooted in our systems of law that are just as flawed as this one. And one of them is the system of felony disenfranchisement. I'm actually going to move myself over here to the side so that you folks can read some of these statistics a little bit better. 1 out of every 16 African American males has been stripped of the right to vote through felony disenfranchisement. And the rate at which African American males are disenfranchised of their rights is 3.5 times greater than every other demographic combined. It is plain and clear how disproportionate felony disenfranchisement affects the African American community. And the whole concept of felony disenfranchisement stems from a belief governmentally that convicted felons don't have the correct judgment required in order to cast a ballot to vote, despite not having a shred of scientific evidence. Thankfully, across the nation, felony disenfranchisement is being walked back, but it's something that is still a major issue across the United States. It's certainly far from over, and it's something that we're going to have to keep our eyes on moving into the future, just as is every other topic that we've brought up today. These issues are issues that you and I, whoever you may be, might not face on a daily basis, but for some people, this is simply the reality of their lives. They must wake up every morning and contend with the fact that there is a political system out there, a government-sponsored system that is rigged against them, that is fighting against their participation. And the more that we can do to combat that, the more that we can do to help against that, the better a society we will have, the more informed an electorate we will have, and the better a democracy we will have. That is everything from me for this episode of the Battered Ballot series. As always, if you have any questions, go ahead and get in the comments. I'm going to link our social media down below. You can go ahead and reach out to us there. If that's it. I stuttered a little bit, couldn't think of what to say. Thank you for watching.